The humidity in the new territories that afternoon in 1971 was heavy, a thick, palpable weight that seemed to cling to the skin and settle deep within the lungs. In the secluded courtyard of a private estate, far removed from the neon-lit chaos of Kowloon, the air was stagnant. The ground was a patchwork of packed, reddish earth and weathered grey flagstones, slick with the fine mist of a coming storm. Surrounding the clearing were ancient, gnarled banyan trees, their hanging roots like frozen curtains in the still air. Small groups of men stood along the perimeter, their presence marked by a heavy, expectant silence. These were not casual spectators. They were practitioners of the old ways, karatekas in white gi, Wing Chun stylists with their hands tucked into their pockets, and older masters who looked on with expressions of grim curiosity. They had come to see a clash of philosophies, a meeting between the rising iconoclasm of Bruce Lee and the rigid, centuries-old discipline of the Japanese blade. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic drone of cicadas and the occasional scuff of a martial artist's shoe shifting on the gravel. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the space. He wore a simple, dark, short-sleeved shirt and loose-fitting black trousers that allowed for total freedom of movement. He did not adopt a theatrical pose. Instead, he stood in a state of relaxed readiness, his weight centered, his breathing so deep and rhythmic that his chest barely seemed to move. His eyes were not fixed on his opponent's face, but on the center line, the space between them where the first movement would manifest. He looked less like a fighter and more like a man waiting for a bus, yet those who knew combat could see the coiled tension in his calves and the way his lead hand flickered with micro-movements, constantly recalibrating the distance. 5 meters away stood Kenjiro, a man whose life was measured in the repetitions of the sword. He was older, his face a map of scars and discipline, his hands thickened by decades of gripping oak and steel. He held a bokken, a Japanese training sword carved from the densest white oak. It was a brutal piece of wood, heavy enough to shatter a femur, and balanced with a precision that made it feel like a natural extension of his skeleton. Kenjiro held the weapon in a traditional Chudan no Kamai, the middle guard. The tip pointed directly at Bruce's throat. To Kenjiro, a man without a weapon was an incomplete warrior, a child playing at a game he didn't understand. "You have gained much fame," Kenjiro said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried no emotion. "But fame is a shadow. It has no substance. In a real encounter, the reach of the blade is the only truth. Without a weapon, you are simply a target, waiting for the wood to find you. Your speed is a luxury you cannot afford against a meter of oak." Bruce didn't answer immediately. He watched the way Kenjiro's thumbs wrapped around the hilt, noting the white pressure on the knuckles. "The wood is only a limit," Bruce finally said. His voice was calm, almost academic, devoid of any desire to provoke. "You rely on the reach because you are afraid of the space between us. You think the sword protects you, but it actually binds you. Let's see if you can hit a man who isn't there." The fight did not begin with a shout or a sudden charge. It began with a slow, agonizingly quiet closing of the distance. Kenjiro moved in the Shiko style, sliding his feet across the earth to maintain a constant height and a stable base. He was hunting for the ma-ai, the perfect interval where his strike would land, while Bruce remained unable to reach him. Bruce responded by circling slowly to his right, his eyes tracking the tip of the bokken. He moved with a light, rhythmic skip, his boots making a soft shik-shik sound against the grit of the courtyard. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt as though the first person to move would shatter the atmosphere. The observers leaned in, their breathing shallow. An older Wing Chun master in the back narrowed his eyes, noticing that Bruce's lead hand was mimicking the vibrations of the sword's tip. Suddenly, Kenjiro exploded. He lunged forward with a ki that was less a shout and more a guttural burst of air. The bokken cut through the humidity with a terrifying whoosh, a vertical strike aimed at the crown of Bruce's head. It was a move designed to end the fight in a single second. Bruce didn't jump back. He stepped diagonally forward and to the left, his shoulder passing so close to the wood that the displaced air hissed in his ear. The bokken slammed into the packed earth, where he had stood a millisecond before, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Kenjiro didn't overextend. He immediately pulled the hilt back to his hip and swung the weapon in a horizontal arc, aiming for Bruce's ribs. Bruce dropped his center of gravity, bending his knees until his thighs were parallel to the ground. The heavy oak passed over him, the wind of the strike actually ruffling his hair. As the sword passed, Bruce snapped a short side entry kick toward Kenjiro's lead knee. It wasn't a powerful kick, but a stop hit meant to disrupt the master's balance. Kenjiro, sensing the danger, retracted his leg and stepped back, resetting his guard. The two men stood for a moment, breathing the heavy air. The crowd was silent, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. Kenjiro was sweating now, the dark patches on his GI spreading. He realized that Bruce wasn't just fast. He was reacting to the intent of the strike before the muscle even moved. Kenjiro changed his tactic. He stopped the wide, power-focused swings and began a series of rapid, short-range thrusts. The tip of the bokken became a blur, darting like a snake's tongue toward Bruce's solar plexus, his throat, and his eyes. Bruce was forced into a frantic defensive rhythm. He used his forearms, specifically the toughened ulnar bone, to parry the wood. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of the oak hitting Bruce's arms was dull and sickening. It was the sound of a hammer hitting a side of beef. Each impact left an immediate, angry red welt on Bruce's tan skin. The force behind Kenjiro's thrusts was immense. He was using his entire body weight, channeled through the narrow point of the training sword. Bruce was being pushed back, his boots skidding across the wet flagstones. He was parrying, but the kinetic energy of the weapon was starting to take its toll. His forearms were swelling, the skin darkening to a deep purple. The observers could see the shift. One of the karateka whispered to his companion, "He can't keep that up. The wood will break his arms eventually." Kenjiro saw his opening. He feinted a low sweep at Bruce's ankles, and as Bruce's weight shifted to jump, Kenjiro aborted the sweep and snapped the bokken upward in a rising diagonal cut aimed at the collarbone. It was a master-level transition, a move that relied on the opponent's own momentum against them. Bruce tried to pivot, his body twisting in midair, but the damp ground betrayed him. His back foot slipped a fraction of an inch on a mossy stone. It was a tiny error, but in a fight of this caliber, it was an eternity. The heavy white oak slammed into Bruce's right shoulder. The sound was a heavy, wet crack, the sound of dense wood hitting dense muscle. The force of the blow was enough to knock a normal man to the ground, unconscious. Bruce's entire torso jerked to the side, his right arm going momentarily numb as the brachial plexus was compressed. He skidded across the courtyard, his left hand reaching out to catch himself on the ground to prevent a total fall. He ended up on one knee, his breath catching in his throat. The silence that followed was suffocating. The cicadas stopped. The observers stood like statues. For the first time, the dragon looked vulnerable. He was kneeling in the dirt, his right arm hanging limp, his face pressed against the pain. Kenjiro didn't follow up. He lowered his bokken, his chest heaving, a grim sense of finality in his eyes. He wasn't a cruel man, but he believed in the hierarchy of the blade. "The lesson is written in the bone," Kenjiro said, his voice strained from the effort. "Flesh and blood cannot close the gap that the sword creates. You are fast, Lee, but you are not made of iron. The reach of the wood is the final word." Bruce remained on one knee for what felt like several minutes, though it was only seconds. He looked down at his shoulder. Through the fabric of his shirt, a massive dark lump was already forming. The muscle was twitching under the skin, a biological reaction to the trauma. He took a long, slow breath, his diaphragm expanding, forcing the air into the bottom of his lungs to settle his nervous system. He gripped his right wrist with his left hand, testing the nerves. A dull, heavy throb began to pulse through his body, synchronized with his heartbeat. Then he looked up. The expression on his face had changed. The analytical, observant quality was gone, replaced by a cold, predatory stillness. It wasn't anger. It was a total removal of ego. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He rotated his right shoulder, and a sharp pop echoed in the quiet air. He didn't rub the bruise. He didn't acknowledge the pain. He simply accepted it as a physical fact of the environment. "You're right about one thing," Bruce said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low vibration. "The reach of the wood is a reality, but you've made a mistake. You think the weapon is your advantage. You don't realize that once the weapon is neutralized, you have nothing else to rely on. You've spent so long leaning on the wood that you've forgotten how to stand on your own." Bruce reached into the small of his back, beneath the hem of his dark jacket. With a sharp, rhythmic clink-clack, he pulled out a pair of nunchaku. These weren't the lightweight, hollow toys used in modern demonstrations. They were made of a dark, dense hardwood, possibly ironwood, and were connected by a thick, high-tension steel chain. The wood was scarred and oily from years of contact with skin. Bruce gripped one handle, and the other dangled, swaying slightly like a pendulum. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The observers, who had been leaning forward in concern, now instinctively moved back another meter. They recognized that the geometry of the fight had fundamentally changed. The reach advantage of the bokken had just been met by the velocity advantage of the chain. Bruce didn't wait. He didn't flourish or pose. He simply started the rotation. At first, it was a low-speed orbit around his waist, the wooden handles clicking together with a steady, mechanical rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. Then he accelerated. The sound changed. It moved from a rhythmic clicking to a low, ominous hum. Within seconds, it became a high-pitched, terrifying scream as the wood tore through the humid air. Bruce began to move his hands in complex, overlapping figure eights. The nunchaku became a blur, a dark, translucent sphere of kinetic energy that seemed to encase his entire body. The speed was so immense that the human eye could no longer track the individual handles. It only saw the shadow of the weapon. The air in the courtyard began to circulate, a miniature windstorm created by the centrifugal force. The fallen leaves on the ground began to swirl in a circle around Bruce's feet. Kenjiro's face went pale. He had spent his life studying the linear paths of the sword. The thrust, the cut, the parry. But this was non-linear. The nunchaku didn't have a single point of impact. It was a shifting, oscillating threat that moved with a velocity he couldn't calculate. Kenjiro let out a desperate, guttural roar and launched a full-power overhead strike. He put every ounce of his remaining strength into the blow, aiming to split the sphere of Bruce's defense. Bruce didn't step aside. He stepped into the strike. As the heavy oak bokken descended, Bruce snapped his right wrist. The chain of the nunchaku didn't just block the wooden sword, it acted as a snare. The chain wrapped around the upper third of the bokken, and the physics of the weapon took over. The momentum of Kenjiro's strike was captured by the chain, and the secondary handle of the nunchaku swung around the bokken with tripled velocity. Whack! The swinging handle struck the bokken just centimeters above Kenjiro's knuckles. The vibration was so violent that Kenjiro's hands were nearly shaken from the hilt. His fingers went numb instantly, the nerves overwhelmed by the shockwave traveling through the oak. Before Kenjiro could even register the loss of control, Bruce unwrapped the chain with a flick of his wrist and began a relentless, high-speed sensory assault. He didn't hit Kenjiro's body. He systematically attacked the weapon. Crack, 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 crack. The nunchaku hit the bokken 4 times in less than a second. Each impact was like a hammer blow against a bell. Bruce was moving around Kenjiro in a tight, predatory circle, his feet moving with a precision that made it look like he was skating on a film of oil. The nunchaku passed over his shoulders, under his arms, and behind his back. The momentum never dipping, the scream of the wood never fading. The sound was like a machine gun, a constant, rhythmic pounding of wood against wood. Kenjiro was forced into a purely defensive crouch. He held the bokken up like a shield, his arms vibrating so hard his vision began to blur. He couldn't see Bruce anymore. He could only see the dark halo of the spinning handles and the occasional flash of Bruce's eyes through the blur. Bruce transitioned the movement. He shifted from the figure eights to a direct, vertical, helicopter spin directly in front of Kenjiro's face. The handles were spinning so fast they created a literal wall of force. The wind from the rotation was so strong it forced Kenjiro to squint, his eyes watering. The tip of the rotating handle was passing less than a centimeter from his nose, the air pressure actually pushing his head back. Kenjiro stood frozen. He was a master of 100 duels, but he was currently experiencing a total breakdown of his combative reality. He realized that the only reason he was still standing was because Bruce was exercising a level of control that was almost supernatural. Bruce wasn't fighting him. He was dismantling the very idea of the fight. The fear wasn't a sudden, sharp panic. It was a slow, heavy realization of total, crushing helplessness. Kenjiro looked into Bruce's eyes through the blur of the hardwood. He saw no anger, no triumph, only a cold, absolute clarity. He realized that in Bruce's world, the sword was just a stick, and the master was just a man holding onto a piece of wood for dear life. Kenjiro's hands began to shake uncontrollably. His grip on the bokken, the grip he had practiced 10,000 times, finally failed. His muscles, exhausted by the vibration and the sheer psychological pressure, simply gave up. He let go. The heavy white oak bokken fell to the earth with a hollow, pathetic thud. It bounced once in the dirt and lay still. Kenjiro's knees buckled shortly after. He didn't fall because of a strike. He fell because the foundation of his world had been erased. He sat back on his heels, his head bowed, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded like a man drowning. He looked at his hands. They were beet red, the skin swollen from the vibrations. The screaming sound of the Nunchaku vanished instantly. With a movement too fast to follow, Bruce caught both handles in his right hand and tucked them under his arm. The silence returned to the courtyard. But it was different now. It was no longer expectant. It was heavy with the weight of a concluded era. Bruce stood over the older man. The bruise on his shoulder was a dark, angry knot of pain, but he didn't acknowledge it. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look to the observers for approval. He stood in the falling light, his body perfectly still, his breathing already returning to its deep, meditative rhythm. The observers remained in their places, motionless. They had seen a fight, but they had also witnessed the death of a certain kind of certainty. The older Wing Chun master in the back slowly let out a long, held breath and looked down at his own hands, his expression one of profound realization. Bruce reached down and picked up the fallen bokken. He didn't look at it with contempt. He turned it over, feeling the grain of the white oak, acknowledging the years of practice that had gone into the wood. He didn't break it. He didn't cast it aside. He stepped forward and placed it gently on the ground, hilt first, in front of the kneeling Kenjiro. "The wood is strong," Bruce said. His voice was quiet, a mere thread of sound in the damp air, but a tool is only a bridge. If you spend your whole life standing on the bridge, you'll never reach the other side. You've mastered the sword, but you haven't mastered the man who holds it. Kenjiro didn't look up immediately. When he finally did, the mask of the rigid traditionalist was gone. His eyes were tired, filled with the weight of a man who had seen a ghost. He looked at the bokken, then at the man standing over him, and gave a single, slow nod. It was the bow of a man who had finally understood that being like water wasn't a poem. It was the terrifying reality of a man who refused to be defined by his tools. Bruce didn't stay for the aftermath. He didn't wait for the rain to start in earnest. He turned and walked toward the stone archway of the courtyard. His gait was steady, his right arm slightly stiff, but his head held high. As he reached the gate, the first real drops of the storm began to fall. They were heavy and cool, hitting the hot stones of the courtyard with a sharp hiss. The rain began to wash away the dust of the struggle and the sweat of the combatants. Bruce walked out into the street, his silhouette fading into the grey, humid mist of the new territories. He left behind a courtyard of silent men and a master who would spend the rest of his life reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the reach of a blade. The story would be told for decades, the day the wood met the chain. But the true lesson wasn't about the weapons. It was about the moment the sword fell, and the realization that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't made of oak or steel, but of the mind that refuses to be contained by either.